Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Thank you all for being here with us. We're going to give a few minutes to all the attendees to join in. I think that they might be in a waiting list, but we're already here with 3 of our speakers, just waiting for the time to meet all of you and to start. So welcome everyone. When everyone is in, we can proceed. So I see the numbers are coming up more slowly. So good morning to everyone in Latin America. We are recording this webinar. So as of now, you are invited, and I will be starting from FINUT to give you the instructions, the first instructions from this very beginning. I would like to greet you all, and I would like to know where you're joining us today. Use the chat to tell us where you're joining us from. I hope that everyone has their chats activated. You also have a section for the Q&A. This will only be devoted for questions for our speakers. If you are kind to use it only for this purpose, it's already funny not to see any comments in the chat. Is it working properly for all our attendees? At any rate, I would like to welcome you all. I want to know if the chat is working properly. And we're going to ask for it to be activated for all the attendees. I see all the attendees. Wonderful. Let's see. Okay, so yes, I'm starting to see all your messages in the chat. So welcome you all. Let's kick this session off. I see that the number of attendees is increasing and these people are joining us at the moment. So welcome everyone and welcome to our speakers and thank you for being here with us today. We are in this webinar today, an online webinar for the update, scientific update on the LNCS from the safety assessment to the EU's recommendations based on evidence and emerging research. We're going to give you some basic instructions or initial instructions. I will remind you that this event will be carried out in 2 languages, in English and in Spanish. So I invite you to use the options that Zoom provides us with. You can see the instructions on screen. I'm sharing them for you. So you will see that in your Zoom screen, you will see how to activate the simultaneous interpretation. At this moment, I don't know if you can see that there's a sort of a globe, the symbol, the icon of a world in the bottom of the screen. I see that you're seeing it. Okay, so you just click on that and then you need to select the language in which you want to be listening to the talks today. We have 1 talk in English and the rest of them will be delivered in Spanish. So please feel free to select Spanish and silence the original or mute the original audio. You will be able to hear all the talks in Spanish, and the one that will be delivered in English, Dr. de GRAAF will give us this talk in English, and you will be able to hear his interpreter, and you can from now choose the language in the interpretation side of Zoom. So I will also ask you to use the chat, to use the Q&A to use the chat to make the more technical questions and the specific questions for our speakers. I'm going to ask you to write them down in the Q&A section. In Spanish, it's called preguntas y respuestas. I already have some of those activated as new questions. I will discard those because they were related to technical matters. So again, for technical matters, please feel free to use the chat part of Zoom. So let me introduce our main moderator for today, Luis Alberto Moreno. He is the president of the Ibero-American Federation of Nutrition. He's very well known among our followers. He has been invited to several of our seminars. He is a professor and has a chair in the University of Zaragoza. I always like to highlight that he was born in Peru, and I'm sure that he is pleased when I remind this to all our Latin American audience. He is working in the University of Zaragoza, and he has a doctorate in human nutrition, public health, community health, and both master's degrees, both degrees in the same university. He also has a master's in nutrition for teenagers and children, and he has received many international awards, and he is the coordinator of the research group that deals with nutrition and development in the University of Zaragoza. He has written over 800 articles in scientific journals and over 100 chapters in different books. He has also been part of the Committee of Nutrition for pediatric population, and he is the chair of he holds a chair in the University of Zaragoza. He has also been recognized as a researcher, and I will leave now the floor to him so you can introduce both the two organizations that are hosting this event today. Thank you very much, Dr. Soto, Maria Jose, for your presentation. I would like just to add that Maria Jose Soto is the scientific director of the FINUT organization. So although I'm supposed to be the main moderator here today, I will be sharing the moderation with her in this session. I would just like to add a few words related to the FINUT, which is the Ibero-American Foundation of Nutrition, and also the ISA, which is the International Association of Sweeteners. FINUT is an non-lucrative organization that was born by the hand of the International Union of Nutrition Sciences, and among the main activities it carries out, we want to highlight the development of different scientific research studies and the elaboration, the preparation of different publications hand in hand with the FAO or the Organization of Ibero-American States, as well as the carrying out of different training and capacity building training hand in hand with other institutions, such as this seminar that we are hosting today. A very important activity for the FINUT is the FINUT conference that takes place every 2 years. In this case, we will be holding this conference at the end of October in Colombia, specifically in the city of Medellin. We will hope that, or we expect to have about 600 participants on site, and we're also very proud of what we call the FINUT community. These are all the people who follow us in the social media and who benefit from receiving scientific information that has been verified and that we share very often in our social media accounts. This is a very brief summary of all the activities that our organization carries out, and I encourage you to follow us on social media and also to find more information about us in our website related to the ISA, the International Sweeteners Association. This is an organization that, without any lucrative purpose, and that has scientific purposes and represents the users and consumers of sweeteners with low calorie content or no calorie content. This association was created over 35 years ago and has been acknowledged by the European Commission, by regulatory authorities, both at national and regional and international level, as well as by the WHO. And it also has a status of non-governmental observer in the Codex Alimentarius Commission, which is the international commission that sets the standards on food. The main mission of the ISA is to provide professionals in the health sector, researchers and regulators, political actors, media, and consumers information on nutrition and scientific information that is as updated as possible related to security and safety and the benefits of LNCS, that is low or no calorie sweeteners. After sharing this information, we can move on to the webinar per se, and I will be introducing our first talk with the title of Scientific Advice and Observers in the Codex Alimentarius by Dr. Diego Varela, who has been the vice chairperson of the Codex Alimentarius Commission since 2021, and he is also in charge of one of the public organizations in Chile since related to nutrition in 2021. He started his career as working for the FAO for Latin American and Caribbean region. He also worked with the international agency from Chile, depending on the Ministry of International Affairs. He also worked as a coordinator of international affairs related to the harmlessness of food, which depended on the Ministry of Agriculture. And among his functions, he has the oversight of the Codex at an international level. And without further ado, we will leave the floor to Dr. Varela that has been recorded. And Dr. Varela has excused himself because he could not attend personally this webinar. Wonderful. So we're going to all close our cameras and just watch the presentation. Please leave your questions in the Q&A section, because even if he's not here with us today, we will forward your questions to him.
Muy buenos días a todas y a todos. Mi nombre es Diego Varela, yo soy secretario ejecutivo de la Agencia Chilena de Inocuidad y Calidad Alimentaria y soy también vicepresidente de la Comisión del Codex Alimentarius, junto al presidente y los otros dos vicepresidentes, de quien les mando un gran saludo. Lamento no poder estar con ustedes hoy, pero justamente mis compromisos en Codex me tienen acá en Roma, en horarios que son incompatibles para mí, para participar en este seminario. Agradezco a los organizadores haberme invitado y voy a hacer todo lo posible para entregarles información sobre qué es el Codex y cómo funciona, cuál es la función del Comité del Codex de Aditivos Alimentarios, CCFA, cuál es el rol de la ciencia en la elaboración de las normas del Codex y también qué papel juegan los observadores. Todo lo que yo les voy a contar está basado en los procedimientos establecidos en el manual de procedimiento, pero son un resumen de ellos, así que para la totalidad de la información los invito a que consulten el manual de procedimiento o se acerquen a los puntos de contacto o a los comités nacionales en cada uno de sus países. Entonces, para empezar, ¿qué es el Codex? El Codex es un proceso y es un resultado. El proceso está compuesto principalmente por la Comisión del Codex y todos sus Estados miembros, 189 países, más la Unión Europea, todos sus observadores y las directrices, qué es lo que hace el Codex, las prioridades que establece, es totalmente establecido por sus miembros. Nosotros como presidente y vicepresidente jugamos un rol de facilitación. Y el Codex también, por supuesto, es un resultado. Es la publicación de todas las normas, directrices y códigos de prácticas, límites máximos de residuos, niveles máximos, que el Codex trabaja a lo largo del año, publica y pone a disposición de todos. ¿Cuál es el propósito del Códex? En primer lugar, proteger la salud del consumidor, porque todos sabemos que las enfermedades transmitidas por los alimentos son un riesgo real, siguen produciendo enfermedad en el mundo y siguen también causando muertes que son evitables y prevenibles. En segundo lugar, garantizar prácticas equitativas en el comercio de alimentos. Hay un tremendo y muy dinámico comercio de alimentos como nunca en la historia de la humanidad. Y el Códex está ahí para asegurar de que ese comercio, de que las distintas medidas que establecen los países se basan justamente en la mejor información científica disponible y en base a un proceso constructivo de elaboración de normas de gestión de riesgo. Promover la coordinación de todos los trabajos de desarrollo de normas alimentarias. Para eso es que tenemos justamente a nuestros observadores, quienes son organismos multilaterales, como la FAO, la OMS, la OMSA, la CIPF, y también a los observadores que representan al sector académico y, por supuesto, sector privado y productivo. Publicar y mantener actualizadas las normas del Codex Alimentarius, que están todas accesibles en la página web del Codex de manera gratuita. ¿Cómo funciona el Codex? De manera general, ahí arriba ustedes pueden ver la comisión del Codex Alimentarius, que está apoyado por un comité ejecutivo y por lo que se llaman los órganos subsidiarios, que ayudan a la comisión a tomar las determinaciones. Estos son los llamados órganos o comités técnicos del Codex, y algunos son de productos específicos y otros ya son de términos más generales como etiquetado, higiene, aditivos, contaminantes, plaguicidas, residuos de medicamentos veterinarios, quienes son también apoyados en todo el funcionamiento por los comités regionales del Códex. En este caso, para América Latina y el Caribe, el Comité Coordinador para América Latina y el Caribe, CCLAC, por sus siglas en inglés. Vamos entonces ahora al Comité de Aditivos del Codex Alimentarius, un comité que es hospedado por China. Es China quien organiza las reuniones y que tiene como mandato, es China quien organiza las reuniones y establece quién será su presidente, y tiene como mandato establecer o ratificar niveles máximos para aditivos alimentarios, trabajar con la lista de aditivos para que el JECFA, y ya voy a entrar a explicarles qué es el JECFA y cómo funciona, evalúe sus riesgos, asignar categorías funcionales a los distintos tipos de aditivos, recomendar especificaciones de identidad y pureza, examinar métodos de análisis para determinar presencia de aditivos alimentarios en conjunto con el Comité de Métodos de Análisis del Códex, y examinar y elaborar normas o códigos para cuestiones afines como el etiquetado de aditivos alimentarios, también en conjunto con el Comité de Etiquetado. ¿Cuál es la norma estrella de este comité? Por supuesto, la norma general para aditivos alimentarios, de la cual les voy a dar una breve mirada. ¿Cuáles son los principios generales que establece esta norma general para aditivos alimentarios o Codex STAN 192? Establece que se incluirán en la norma aditivos que no presenten riesgos apreciables para la salud. La inclusión de aditivos se efectúa teniendo en cuenta toda ida o evaluación equivalente de la inocuidad establecida para el aditivo por el JECFA y su ingestión diaria probable proveniente de todas las fuentes. Cuando el aditivo alimentario se emplee en alimentos destinados a grupos especiales de consumidores, se tendrá en cuenta la ingestión diaria probable del aditivo para esos consumidores. La cantidad de aditivo que se añada a un alimento será igual o inferior a la dosis máxima de uso y constituirá la dosis mínima necesaria para lograr el efecto técnico que se está buscando, y la dosis máxima de uso podrá basarse en la aplicación de los procedimientos que se establecen en la norma y también en las evaluaciones de ingestión realizadas por los Estados miembros del Códex o en una valoración independiente de las evaluaciones nacionales de la ingestión solicitada al JECFA o a través del Comité de Aditivos. Justificación del uso de aditivos: está justificado únicamente si ello ofrece alguna ventaja, no presenta riesgos apreciables para la salud de los consumidores, no induce error, cumple con una o más de las funciones tecnológicas que se está buscando, y únicamente cuando estos fines no pueden alcanzarse por medios que son económica y tecnológicamente factibles. Está también justificado para conservar la calidad nutricional del alimento, con algunas consideraciones que están descritas ahí. Está justificado también para proporcionar los ingredientes o constituyentes necesarios para los alimentos fabricados para grupos de consumidores que tienen necesidades dietéticas especiales, para aumentar la calidad de conservación o la estabilidad de un alimento o mejorar sus propiedades organolépticas y para proporcionar ayuda en la fabricación, elaboración, preparación, tratamiento, envasado, transporte o almacenamiento del alimento. A condición de que, claro, este aditivo no se utilice para enmascarar ciertos efectos del empleo de materias primas defectuosas o prácticas no higiénicas. Por supuesto, eso nunca puede pasar. ¿De dónde procede la ciencia que usa Codex para establecer sus normas? Lo que les voy a comentar está descrito mucho más en profundidad en los principios de análisis de riesgos aplicados por el Comité del Codex de Aditivos Alimentarios y también en general en los distintos capítulos de este manual, que ya está algo más fácil de navegar, sobre los principios generales para el uso de la ciencia y el proceso de análisis de riesgo. Si ustedes quieren ir en específico a la página que tengo ahí seleccionada por el Comité de Aditivos, pueden entrar en la página 115 y ahí tienen enlace directo de este manual en versión español. De todas maneras lo pueden ver en la página web del Codex. Ahora, el análisis de riesgo es un proceso que en mi experiencia no es del todo entendido, comprendido y por lo tanto bien aplicado. ¿Cómo se entiende en Codex, que pasa a servir también como una base para que los países después establezcan marcos nacionales para la implementación del enfoque de análisis de riesgo? En base a 3 etapas que nosotros generalmente ya todos los que estamos metidos en inocuidad conocemos bastante bien, que es la evaluación de los riesgos, la gestión de los riesgos y la comunicación de los riesgos. La evaluación de los riesgos pasa a ser ya la parte más científica, la ciencia. Y tiene las 4 etapas clásicas: identificación del peligro, caracterización del peligro, estimación de la exposición y evaluación del riesgo para la población. Esto se debe hacer de manera separada de la gestión de riesgo. Y en la gestión de riesgo, en el Codex, si ustedes se recuerdan lo que les acabo de contar de las distintas funciones, en primer lugar está la protección de la salud. Y en segundo lugar también hay que ver cómo se balancea eso con las prácticas equitativas del comercio. O sea, cómo establezco yo medidas que protejan la salud, pero que no sean enormemente restrictivas. O sea, yo gestiono el riesgo. El riesgo cero en los alimentos no existe. La cosa es llevarlo a un nivel aceptable, donde no voy a estar causando daño a la población de manera aguda o crónica, pero que al mismo tiempo me permite efectivamente comercializar esos alimentos a través de la frontera y, en el caso de los países, en los mercados nacionales. Y la comunicación de riesgo apunta a la transparencia. Es una comunicación que debe existir entre los gestores y los evaluadores, entre las medidas que se toman de gestión de riesgo y la población, con la academia, con el sector productivo, con otros países, con otros organismos del Estado. Apunta principalmente a poner a disposición las razones por las cuales se está tomando una decisión de manera que quede claro. Y la comunicación de riesgo tiene que ser a lo largo de todo el proceso. Hay que comunicar lo que se está evaluando, cómo se está evaluando y los resultados, y hay que comunicar también el proceso que se está llevando a cabo y las discusiones que se están teniendo en la toma de decisiones para la gestión de esos riesgos. Entre la evaluación de los riesgos y la gestión debe existir una separación funcional. ¿Para qué? Para garantizar la integridad científica de la evaluación, evitar la confusión entre las funciones y, de alguna manera también, junto a varios otros mecanismos, atenuar cualquier conflicto de interés. En el Codex también está separado funcionalmente la comisión del Codex Alimentarius, junto a todos sus órganos subsidiarios. Los comités técnicos lo que hacen es gestión de los riesgos en base a información científica. Por eso las normas del Codex están basadas o tienen como pilar fundamental la ciencia, pero no son un copy-paste. El Codex no hace evaluación de riesgo. El Codex solicita evaluación de riesgo a organismos fuera de su estructura. Y estos organismos también no prestan solo asesoramiento al Codex, no son exclusivos del Codex. Son también organismos que pueden prestar asistencia directa a los miembros cuando se lo piden, porque son organismos de la FAO y la OMS, que son JEMRA, JECFA, JMPR y JEMNU. Vamos a ver entonces el trabajo de la JECFA, que es el Comité Mixto FAO-OMS de Expertos en Aditivos Alimentarios. Tiene, por supuesto, junto con todos los organismos que hacen evaluación de riesgo, como pilares, como principios básicos de asesoramiento, la solvencia, la responsabilidad, la objetividad, la equidad, la transparencia y la inclusividad para llevar a cabo sus tareas. Fue establecida en 1956, existía antes de que funcionara el Codex Alimentarius, que O sea, cumplió 60 años el 2023 y hace evaluación de riesgo para aditivos alimentarios, para contaminantes en los alimentos y para residuos de medicamentos veterinarios. Entonces sirve de manera directa a 3 comités distintos del Codex: el de aditivos, el de contaminantes y el CCRBDF de medicamentos veterinarios. Define límites de residuos, límites máximos de medicamentos veterinarios y niveles máximos para contaminantes. Y las evaluaciones de riesgo sirven como base para las normas y reglamentos nacionales e internacionales de inocuidad alimentaria. O sea, sirve de base para el Codex, pero también para cualquier país que se lo solicite. ¿Cuáles son los productos de la JECFA? Van a tener monografías que publica la FAO, que tiene especificaciones de aditivos alimentarios, métodos analíticos y evaluaciones de residuos de medicamentos veterinarios. Las monografías que publica la JECFA, que tienen distintos tipos de datos que pueden ver ahí, datos biológicos y toxicológicos, que se consideran también evaluaciones de exposición y otras referencias relevantes, y los reportes técnicos que vienen a hacer un resumen de todo lo que el comité logró. ¿Cuánto demora una evaluación de la JECFA? Aproximadamente 1.5 años desde que hacen el primer llamado hasta que ya están publicadas sus resultados. Entonces hay un lapsus de 1.5 años entre que, en este caso, el Codex, el comité de aditivos, le va a hacer una primera pregunta, la JECFA junta la información y después puede entregar un resultado. Esto varía, por supuesto, podría ser más, podría ser menos, pero en general tiende a ceñirse este tiempo porque son reuniones que están bien programadas y que funcionan en base a una agenda. Ahora, ¿quién es JECFA? Son los invitados, los científicos que invita la FAO y la OMS, que también designan a un presidente y vicepresidente y 2 relatores de entre los científicos que están invitados. Es la secretaría que la proporciona la FAO y la OMS, y son los representantes de los distintos comités del Codex que están haciendo esa solicitud si es que es necesario. Es importante entender que son reuniones privadas, es solo por invitación y no hay observadores ni patrocinadores. Y la selección de expertos, por supuesto, la hace FAO y la OMS en base a credenciales científicas, buscando representación regional y equilibrio de género, aunque en la región estamos al debe en el envío y la participación de expertos. Los observadores en el Codex, en el Codex la verdad es que es muy apreciada el rol que tienen los observadores. Tendríamos poca autoridad en el campo de establecimientos internacionales si no estuviéramos escuchando y abiertos a entender cuáles son los dolores, cuáles son las preocupaciones de los observadores. Y por eso entonces la colaboración con los observadores facilita que el Codex acceda a información, asesoramiento y asistencia de expertos que no tiene entre sus filas y que tampoco están en los gobiernos. Permite a los observadores expresar sus opiniones durante las reuniones del Codex de manera escrita y verbal, y procura también la armonización de los intereses intersectoriales, porque, como les decía, estas dos funciones de proteger la salud y prácticas equitativas del comercio tienen que estar en equilibrio. Los privilegios: participar en las reuniones del Codex con derecho a voz. Esto siempre lo maneja el presidente, a veces el tiempo no da, siempre se le da la palabra a los miembros y después se abre a los observadores. En general hay una buena participación de los observadores. Enviar por escrito y en forma, ojo, no resumida, las opiniones que tienen sobre los distintos temas, y presentar declaraciones escritas sobre cuestiones que están siendo sometidas por examen de la comisión del Codex para comunicarlas a la comisión o también al comité ejecutivo. Obligaciones, por supuesto: cooperar con la comisión del Codex para obtener los objetivos que el Codex busca, ayudar al Codex a evitar que se dupliquen los trabajos, contribuir a promover un mejor conocimiento y comprensión del Codex, que es justamente lo que estamos haciendo acá. Así que muchas gracias de nuevo a los organizadores, y también están enviando información a la Secretaría del Codex. ¿Cómo participan los observadores? Opinando durante las reuniones del Codex, todas las que estén realizándose, enviando comentarios por escrito, participando en la respuesta a cartas circulares, participando en los grupos de trabajo electrónico y físico, y, por supuesto, muy importante, siendo parte de los comités nacionales del Codex. Aquí está el correo de Codex, la página web y la cuenta en X, y, por supuesto, mis agradecimientos a la FAO, a la OMS, a las secretarías de JECFA, de FAO y de OMS, y en especial a la secretaría del Codex, a Giuseppe Dichera, que me ayudó con esta presentación. Muchísimas gracias.
We're going to start with the following presentation on LNC's intake, particularly in Chile. I know that this is a very relevant topic right now within the region. So Dr. Samuel Moran is a nutritionist from the University of Concepción in Chile. He has a master in health promotion, and he has a PhD in nutrition and food from EVINTA, which is the university in Chile, and he's the director of the Masters of Nutrition in Public Health in San Sebastián. And he researches on nutrition and public health, and he has several publications and contributions to books, and he's a member of the board of the Alliance, Ibero-American Alliance on Nutrition. Thank you very much for being here with us, Doctor, and we're going to get started with his presentation on the intake of LNCS in Chile. Can you hear me well? Yes. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I would like to share the experience in Chile with regard to LNCS intake. First of all, I would like to point out why it's important to talk about sugar, because somehow sugar intake around the world has multiplied over the last decades. And when it is excessive, it is associated to cardiovascular disease and obesity, diabetes type 2, and cavities. And there's an absence of nutrition benefits that compensate for it. The marketing is usually targeted to usually marginalized populations. In 2016, Chile took the second place around the world in the intake of sugar and the 6th in consumption of salt around the world. We used to consume 142 grams of sugar per day. That means 3/4 of a cup of sugar. And in a publication by Lancet, Chile actually had the first place in the consumption of sweetened beverages by overtaking other countries like the US. If we think about the recommendation of 5% of sugar intake, which is the maximum consumption should amount to 10% of the total amount of calories per day, we had 142. That means many times higher. Now, with regard to the Lancet study that we can see on top of the screen, apparently we're doing very well in Chile because we take the last place in sugar consumption in Latin America. But in the other studies, we take a very different position within the ranking. Now, let's see what happened with the consumption of prepackaged front sugar. Chile is the first country around the world with a front packaging that is compulsory. There is a lot of evidence with regard to what happens to front labeling in packaging with warning that has been a model with what's happening around the world. And before I provide you with the data, we have to remember what the IGI, which is related to body weight, and it's the amount of additives that can be taken every day without risk, and that is expressed in milligrams per kilogram of weight per day. Now let's start with this first study that is pretty old. It dates back to 2011. So the data was collected between 2009, 2010, and it assesses the number of LNCs intakes in Valparaíso, in Chile. And this is a study we carried out with school students. When we revised the literature, we realized that there weren't any sweetener studies in Spanish. Everything that had been published so far had been in English. And what's interesting is that 281 students of both genders, primary school students, well, they all consumed products that contain LNCS. None of them actually overtook the ADI, And back then, there used to be very cheap fizzy drinks that were not labeled as diet or zero beverages, but they did contain LNCS, and their intake was higher among children with obesity problems. Then we have a newer study published in 2014 with 16-year-old children that are between primary and secondary school, and we wanted to see if they had associations with body weight. We didn't see any association with body weight, but 96% of the more than 1,000 children we assessed did consume LNCS daily. And we didn't see an association with body weight. But in this surveys in Chile, we are actually forced to, in addition to the nutritional box, we need to point out if that food contains LNCS, what kind of sweetener it contains, and in which amount of percentage. So for us in Chile, it's really easy to carry out these surveys because we can identify foods easily, we can photograph them, and we know how much LNCS they contain. Then we wanted to assess consumption in Latin America, comparing it with Chile. You can see the bars over here. We're comparing Peru, Chile, Panama, and Guatemala. I believe that consumption of sweeteners is much higher in diet folks in Chile with regard to the rest of Latin America. Back then, for example, it was pretty common to have diet fizzy drinks. And in the past, you used to go to Brazil and Peru and you didn't have some. When in Chile, we were already consuming LNCS. For example, if you went to have a coffee, that you were given, for example, both sugar and sweeteners. And in other Latin American countries, people were only served coffee and then sugar. Then we started some studies about stevia consumption, and we found a low consumption, but it was associated with normal body weight. And stevia hadn't penetrated the market yet. Right now in Chile, stevia is present among table sweeteners and then in all kind of dairy products. And then we came to the front package labeling. We started in 2016 with the first batch of solid foods with solid sugar. If they overcame a certain amount, they had to have a warning that would say high in sugar. In 2019, that was the third stage, that came down to 10%. And when it comes to liquid food in 2016, it used to be 6 grams. And in 2019, it was 5 grams. So right now, we're going to have the 8-year anniversary since we started the front packaging labeling, and we're getting to the last stage. And these are 4 warning signs, octagons as we call them. And let's see what happened with the intake of high sugared products. Let's see whether it came up or down after this front package labeling. So we ranked first back in 2016, remember, with 142 grams. In 2023, we didn't rank first, but we ranked 14 with 58.2 grams. And we disappeared from the top 4 ranking for sweetened beverage intake. However, there is a massification of food containing sweeteners because so that the industry would avoid this high in sugar octagon warning, well, the industry modified foods, particularly foods that were high in sugar. And this involved the whole work because it's not that easy. Maybe it might be easy when it comes to beverages, but not when it comes to yogurt, for instance. So there's some technology involved. So for example, the 67% of dairy products in Chile, they contain sweeteners compared to others in Spain, for instance. Or when it comes to non-alcoholic beverage, 54% of beverages in Chile have sweeteners compared to 23% in the United States. And you can see here all of the different figures according to countries. Now, what happens with the food, solid food? Well, this is a study that was carried out that analyzed all of the foods present in the country after the application of the law, and we have noticed that the food contains less sodium, less sugar, and less saturated fat. So there's been a change. The foods that we're consuming right now in Chile are different from the ones we consumed until 2016. And what happens with sweeteners? Are we overcoming the ADI with all of these foods containing sweeteners? We carried out some studies among children, pregnant women, and we're starting to publish data. We're still analyzing data that cannot be published yet. And the first study, which is based on children with different socioeconomic levels, is a study by the Católica University, and it demonstrated that there was massive intake of these foods, and they didn't find out that the ADI was actually surpassed. The University of Chile also assessed and this information, and even though there were 5 children that actually had higher levels of ADI, they had to carry out another analysis, and they eliminated this part, and finally no child actually had a higher ADI level, but there was massive consumption in both groups. With regard to pregnant women, this is a study in which I took place. We had pregnant women participating, 601 actually, and they consume LNCS, but none of them actually had higher ADI levels. Maybe the highest level was for stevia, but there's an issue here. We have stevia glucose, and we have an IDI of 4, but it should amount to 12. So maybe the value is not 82, but it's a third of such value. And if we look at the rest of the top levels of ADI, we have 44, 26, and 11. And the average intake never is above 10%. Now, what happens with ACHIPIA? When we had an assessment of a chronic diet exposure to sweeteners in foods consumed by the Chilean population. And they used the food survey of 2010. And what did they find? Well, they used 2 scenarios, 2 conventional scenarios and 2 refined scenarios. That means with regard to brands and high consumption. And they didn't find in these 4 scenarios that they had higher levels of ADI. Maybe when it comes to very young children, 2-year-olds, they were higher. And the categories that actually contributed to higher levels of ADI were powdered juice, amongst others. Now, if we look at the rest of the continent, Argentina and Mexico have warnings for LNCS content. And I'm not going to delve deeper into this topic because there's going to be another presentation on this topic, but Chile did not have that warning. There is a new proposal of a warning for the content of LNCS, particularly to prevent its consumption among children. And since October 2023, the government has been analyzing to incorporate this warning in food and beverage. Now, what is this proposal based on? On a phony study that regards LNCS consumption amongst different kinds of children from lower socioeconomic levels. And they compare this data to what's happening to Mexico and Argentina, where there's scarce evidence. We also had studies regarding whether it is a good or bad idea to incorporate a warning. There was a criteria study with regard to the perception that consumers in Chile have with regard to LNCS, and consumers did find this information relevant, but they believe that this label suggested by the health minister is not the most appropriate because they find it a little bit aggressive. But they said, well, this is not going to be an octagon like the other warnings we have, but we're going to have a rectangle maybe. But the population thought to give the information the idea that it doesn't equate to the other warnings. But 42% of the people surveyed would choose food high in sugar and not a kind of food that would have this warning regarding the presence of LNCS. And this was quite worrying. Here I've got an example. We have a family, for example, that consumes sweetened sodas. They might find a beverage that is high in sugar and another beverage that carries the warning of LNCS warning. I don't know any population study that would demonstrate that people would opt for water. I think that population opts for the food they prefer, that is cheap, that responds to their pleasure sort of like choice. So given the same brand, apparently people will be more likely to choose the product that is high in sugar, that is more palatable than the one that contains LNCS. So maybe we might have a reversal in everything that we have achieved along these 8 years. So we've had an important reduction of sugar intake. If you'd like to participate in this public survey, you have the information over here and the link. You have all of the guidelines, all of the ways to participate, and you can take part in this public consultation. And I believe that with this, I'm going to close my speech, and here I'll leave you the QR code for my contact details. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Moreno. Then maybe we can start with the following presentation. You can actually add your questions in the Q&A section. I think that Dr. Durán can see them, and if he can answer them in writing, he'll do so, or he can choose a couple of them so that he can answer them over here. I think that we ourselves have some questions. Thank you very much, Dr. Durán, for this very interesting, illuminating speech. You were talking about Chile, but we did get to have access to very interesting information about the rest of the region. So we ask you to stay with us for the Q&A section. Dr. Moreno, thank you, Maria Jose. I'd like to congratulate Dr. Durán as well for this wonderful presentation and all of this relevant information he has presented that I'm sure will be subject to debate and questions. And now we're going to start with the following presentation that has to do with global recommendations and scientific evidence on LNCS by Hugo LAVIADA-MOLINA from the Marista University in Mexico. Dr. LAVIADA is surgeon and doctor by the Yucatan University. He's a specialist in endocrinology in the postgraduate unit of the medicine faculty of the Autónoma University of Mexico. He has a master in medical science and endocrinology at the University of Sheffield in the United Kingdom. His personality in the Marista de Mérida, Mexico University. He has carried out several research work and papers that have contributed to the health sector. And he works on the treatment prevalence of diabetes and other endocrine disorders. And his aim is to improve the treatment of such disorders. Dr. LAVIADA, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, ISA and FINUT, for the invitation to this webinar. And we are going to talk about aspects that regard clinical aspects and scientific evidence on the use of LNCS.
So these are my statements related to conflicts of interest. And we started talking about the concern that the WHO statement has produced a couple of years ago, and also the official publication where the WHO suggested that LNCS should not be used with the purpose of weight management or to decrease the risk of non-contagious diseases. We're talking about non-communicable diseases such as heart risks and illnesses related to certain brain damages. There was certain information that seemed contradictory, for instance, from the DGA from 2020-2025, that stated that replacing the use of LNCS could decrease the caloric intake in the short term and be help in the weight management, although there are certain concerns related to its efficiency in the long term. This is what we call the evidence pyramid. Where does the information come from? That's where the data are taken in order to produce these recommendations from the international organizations. Well, these evidence come from RCTs that are at the top of this pyramid of evidence. Also, this information can come from observational studies. Observational studies have the advantage that they can include a large number of people and a long-term follow-up. However, they cannot really establish a causality. That means if the intervention factor that is being subject to assessment is the real direct cause of the problem we are analyzing, or if there are other confounding factors. The RCTs, however, are designed to control all confounding factors and to determine and establish the causality. Very quickly, I will try to portray here what was the basis for the publication of the WHO. The WHO gave more importance for doing its conditioned recommendation to the observational studies or the cohort studies, which are the ones that have a lower degree of evidence, very low or low degree of evidence, because there might be many confounding factors. Here we could see a positive connection between obesity and the increase in the BMI, with the appearance of diabetic events and even certain cardiovascular diseases. However, in the same work, which is a systematic revision with a meta-analysis charged by the WHO, Magali Rios and Mr. Montes, in order to obtain the information that had been used by the panel of experts from the WHO to produce this information, they showed that there were RCTs. They published a very interesting document with very valuable information. However, we see that in the RCTs, it is demonstrated and suggested that when the LCNS are used as a replacement of sugars, there are certain discrete loss of weight. It doesn't affect the glycemic markers such as insulin or glucose, or the HOMA resistance for index for insulin resistance. We do not see an increase in cardiovascular diseases, and we have not seen any data suggesting presence or appearance of cancer. However, we have seen a reduction in the caloric intake, energy intake, and also a decrease in the sugar intakes, because the LCNS are replacing sugars. These within the quality of the evidence ranking, we see that this can be rated as low to moderate evidence or certainty. However, the WHO thought that these observational study data were more valuable than others. But what is the evidence that appears in the observational studies? As you can see, we only observe within the cohorts people who are using on a regular basis by their own wish or by their own requirements, LNCS. And these people already had a higher BMI than those people who never use LNCS. They have over 100 centimeters in waist circumference. And this leads us to think that they're probably consuming or using these LNCS because they have a previous problem. And this is why maybe they are more inclined to have a certain overweight or to develop obesity, and there maybe are higher risk of developing diabetes or metabolic syndrome or other cardiovascular diseases, not because they are using the LNCS, but rather because they are people who are using these LNCS trying to avoid the risks of these diseases. The people who never or rarely use LNCS have fewer factors of risk, and this is why they have a lower potential for developing these type of diseases that I've mentioned. We have the Imamura revision from 2015, where several cohorts, the most important ones around the world, were analyzed. He determined that there was a 25% higher risk by using crude data for developing diabetes in the users of higher amounts of LNCS. However, if we make this statistical adjustments in order to limit the confounding variables weight, or what we call reverse causality, is when we use one single adjustment factor, we decrease the 25% to an 8% in terms of the risk of developing these diseases among the cohort. So in many studies, we have seen that the correlation disappears between the LNCS use and the development of certain diseases. This is what we call reverse causality, where people who are using LNCS are using those because they already have conditions that predispose them to have an increased weight, and they're trying to combat their obesity or their risk factors. And probably LNCS are not the cause, but rather a consequence of their issue. When we use models that really adjust the confounding factors, this causality relation disappears. This is what we see in one of the studies with the RCT model, where the only difference here is prospective studies. They are randomized, they're double-blind, etc. We see that all patients come into the study with certain conditions related to the body mass index and other parameters that are exactly the same, because the randomization of all the participants allow us to have the participants to start with exactly the same starting conditions. And this is what we saw in the previous slide as well, that the observational studies, we saw that there are certain P's that are non-significant factors. We can also see here in a systematic Cochrane review of controlled clinical trials with a higher level of evidence, where we can see that when we use this model, the randomization prevents the biases from appearing. And what we see here, you can see this in the line of non-effects. When we compare the users of LNCS users to placebo users, there is no increase in the weight, there is no increase in the lipids, there is no modification in the insulin, and all the diamonds and the squares that you see here are all above the non-effect line, which compared to the risk that we saw in the observational studies. We have developed systematic review with meta-analysis that we published in obesity reviews, where we analyzed all these studies that have been published with a design of RCT that included around 3,000 individuals, and to assess the use of LNCS with different comparators, but always using the RCT model. And what we found is that the global effect of all these studies, comparing the non-caloric sweeteners with other competitors, including sugar, is that there is a trend for a reduction of weight compared to what we saw in the observational studies. If we separate and take only the studies comparing the LNCS with and having a control group with having a placebo or non-caloric comparator, what we see is a neutral effect. That is, the non-caloric sweeteners do not present a decrease in the weight. It is the replacement of the sugar that favors the weight loss in people who are actually replacing sugar by other substances. When we compared and assessed the studies where we replaced sugar, the LNCS replaced sugar, we do see a comparative weight reduction. Finally, this is a work that we are carrying out with our Harvard group, the group of Mr. Espinosa and Willett and ourselves. We compared the same observational studies. This is a very well-known cohort of the nurses in the United States. And what we see here is that when in the observational studies, we do not only have basal consumption data based on nutritional surveys, but rather we have an assessment of consumption every 4 years, because unfortunately in the cohort that were used by the WHO, what we have is a basal consumption assessment, but many people change their trends of consumption, and many people throughout their lives start using for the first time LNCS, or many people who did use LNCS start having water. So if we have a sort of a trend of the changes in consumption every 4 years, we can make a comparison between the different changes in the same cohort studies, where we got to the, in my opinion, wrong conclusion that LNCS are connected to obesity and other comorbidities of chronic diseases. This avoids having a reverse causality effect, and we could use 250 models in order to avoid any confounding factors. What we see in these findings is that when we replace the sugary drinks by non-caloric drinks in observational studies, we see that there are different data from those that the WHO found. We see a reduction in the weight of the individuals. It's not a significant amount of people, because the only thing that we're doing is displacing the sugars, but there is a positive effect. If we replace sugary drinks with water, as we did with the LNCS, we also have a very similar response in terms of the weight decrease. And if we replace LNCS with water, we see a slight advantage that falls on the side of water, but they have almost the same behavior, water and NCS. So if we replace water if we replace sugary drinks by LNCS, we achieve a reduction in weight that is moderate, but that can be spotted in RCTs, but that cannot be detected if we only use basal data of consumption, if we do not use strategies of assessment of change against other change in order to see what's really going on through time. If we only assess the data in a basal manner, there's the serious risk of having a strong bias where the exposure to sweeteners is not properly assessed. To go back to the conditioned recommendation from the WHO, which is a sort of weak recommendation, we also see the American Diabetes Association, Diabetes Canada, also United Kingdom associations, the European Diabetes Association, or even the American Heart Association suggest that based on evidence, LNCS can be used to replace sugars, free sugars, or added in the diet, and in this way reducing the caloric intake. Please, you can find here my email, and I am at your disposal to provide you with all the articles that we have used for preparing this talk. And I want to thank ISA again for allowing me to present this work.
Thank you very much. I believe that our first conclusion is that we need to base our assessment on the best scientific evidence based on RTC, but also on observational studies, but as long as we apply proper strategies as substitution models. And since we'll have a debate later, we're going to start with the next speech. Maria Jose Soto. Thank you, Dr. Lavia. I believe that this being a very interesting speech. We've had so many statistics, and we always believe that cross-cutting and observational studies cannot provide causality data, but now, today, we delved a little bit deeper into this information. Now, for those who haven't been with us from the very beginning, let me just remind our viewers that you have the interpretation service. You have an interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen. We're going to continue with Kees GRAAF, and you can choose in that globe if you either want to hear this presentation in Spanish or in English, and if you want to silence the original audio so that you can only listen to the interpreter while Dr. de Graaf presents his speech in English. So you can use this function from now on. And now I'm going to introduce our next speech. Does exposure to sweet taste enhance sweetness liking? And this is the question that Professor Kees de Graaf is going to answer. He comes from the Netherlands. He's an emeritus teacher in sensory and behavioral, food behavioral attitudes in this university. He's very well known because of his work in this field, and even more so because of his research on sensory perception of food, appetite regulation, and how these factors impact on the intake and choice of foods. All of that with the objective to improve our understanding of food behaviors and promote more healthy diet patterns. His research has important impacts on public health, nutrition, and the development of strategies to combat obesity and diet-related disorders. Dr. Kees de Graaf, the floor is yours. I can see already your slides. Thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me, for giving this talk. It's an honor to present this work to you, and I'm sorry I don't speak any Spanish. I hear Spanish often. My daughter-in-law is Spanish, but I don't speak Spanish, so I will deliver the speech in the talk in English. And the question is indeed, does exposure to sweet taste induce sweetness liking. So if you get exposed to sweet tastes, does that lead to an increase in sweetness liking, or does it not? With respect to conflicts of interest, during my career, I've worked with many food companies, but also with many NGOs and government organizations, as well as the European Union and Dutch Fundamental Sciences. And this slide presents my major collaborators during my career. So that's really a diverse set of companies, institutions, but also NGOs and the European Commission. When you look at the societal and scientific narrative on sugar and sweetness, as it is proposed in many countries in Europe, also in, I would say, the Netherlands and United States, United Kingdom, the narrative is that if you give, for instance, children something sweet to eat, they will habituate to the sweetness and they learn to like more sweetness. That in effect results in a higher liking for sweetness, but also a higher sugar intake. And of course, higher sugar intake and energy intake will lead to obesity. I won't go into detail in the whole chain of events from sweetness, a low sweetness liking to a high sweetness liking to obesity, but I will focus on the first part of this narrative. Does exposure to sweetness leads to a higher subsequent liking or consumption? And that's the topic of my, my current talk. When you look at the literature and also when you look at the narratives that people use at a party in the evening, well, they will say, well, if you use sweetness all the time, you will repeatedly be exposed to the sweetness of a particular food, and you will habituate to the level of sweetness in foods. Another mechanism that is proposed, you see that very often from the, I would say, from the medical community, is they say, well, a sweet taste by itself will lead, a sweet taste on your tongue will lead to a signal in your brain that will lead to a heightened insulin response and a distorted glucose response that will in the end lead to higher hunger levels and preferences for sweet taste. And that's a more physiological type of explanation. And yeah, I've worked on both of these issues. The effect of repeated exposure on I would say liking is very clear in children and in other people. At the start of my career, a long time ago, I did the question on sweet taste promoting intake was already prevalent, I would say, at the start of the 1990s. And then I did one of the first studies in my whole career where I looked at the effects of, I would say, sweet carbohydrates versus savory tasting carbohydrates, and gave people a preload, either of 250 kilocalories or 500 or 750 kilocalories, either being sweet or being savory. And this is, you see photographs of the meals. And the composition of the meals were exactly the same. So they contain the same amount of weight, carbohydrates, fat, protein, fiber, except that one set was sweet and the other set was non-sweet. Then we gave people their preload, and 90 minutes later we gave them a test meal, and people could choose of sweet and non-sweet food items. And what you see here is that the higher the intake from the preload, so 750 kilocalories compared to 250 kilocalories, that led to a reduction in intake in the subsequent meal. But what you see is that taste did not have any effect on the absolute amount of intake. It did have an effect on the choice of foods that people chose during the test meal. So if people had a sweet preload, they chose less sweet foods. And if people had a savory preload, they chose less savory foods. So sweetness affected the choice because of they were satiated for the sweet taste, but not the actual energy content of the subsequent meal. Later on, I think almost 20 years later, we did a similar study, but then a slightly longer term. During one day of 24 hours, we gave people either only sweet foods to eat, or only savory foods to eat, or a mix of sweet and savory foods to eat. And then we measured the food intake and the taste of the food that people consumed in a lunch meal 24 hours later. So you must imagine that we asked people to come to the lab for a lunch, and in that lunch they were either given only sweet tasting foods or only savory tasting foods, or a mixture of these. And subsequently during that day and also the next breakfast, they were either provided with sweet foods, savory foods, or a mixture of those foods. And when you have the idea that sweet foods would enhance, sweetness would enhance intake, then of course you would expect that the consumption of sweet foods would lead to a higher intake or higher calorie intake in subsequent lunch 24 hours later. This is the main effect, what you see after the sweet diet, after the savory diet, or after the mixed diet. And what you see is that there's absolutely no effect on the energy intake during that lunch. In the subsequent day. What you do see is that after the sweet diet, people consume less sweet foods because they are satiated with the sweetness. And after the savory diet, they consume more sweet foods because they are satiated with the savory diet. And after the mixed diet, it's more or less in between. So what you see is that when people consume sweet foods, they also get satiated with the sweetness, and I think that's because of the notion that sweetness signals carbohydrates and energy, and if you are exposed to a lot of sweetness, you get bored with the sweetness and you stop eating. I will show that later in a movie as well. If you look at, I showed just two studies. If you look at the broader literature and systematic reviews on this issue, there have been two systematic reviews on the issue whether sweetness exposure drives a sweet tooth. One was published in 2018 in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. And in that paper, it was concluded that the effects of sweet taste exposure on sweetness preferences were not clear. More recent study, systematic review, was published by David Mila and Davido Rosso in the British Journal of Nutrition. And they concluded that recent longitudinal observational studies, both in infants, children, and in adults, they report no significant associations between exposure to sweet foods and beverages with measures of sweet taste preferences. So overall, although it's widely assumed that exposure to sweetness stimulates greater liking and desire, it's simply there's no evidence for it, and the data do not show this actually. Another way of reasoning, and as I said, it comes mainly from the medical field, is that people will say, well, when you get exposed to sweet taste on your tongue, whether it's sugar or whether it's low energy sweeteners, your brain will expect sugar. And of course, that will generate cephalic phase insulin response, and therefore, the low energy sweetener will disrupt glucose insulin metabolism. Well, to be honest, in 2008, we published a study ourselves on cephalic phase responses and appetite. And at that time, I was a strong believer in this kind of evidence and also in my perception on how taste worked. And we started to work on this. And we spent hundreds of thousands of euros on finding a cephalic phase response to low energy sweeteners. but again and again we couldn't find it. And yeah, and about 4 or 5 years ago, we published, did a systematic review on the cephalic phase insulin response to sweet taste on your tongue. Yeah, and despite my search for years and years, we found little evidence for cephalic phase insulin response having functional consequences. Indeed, doesn't have any effect on satiation and also no effect on glucose homeostasis. So we think the cephalic phase insulin response does not have a very meaningful effect in daily life. This is actually confirmed by also a recent systematic review and meta-analysis published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition by Catherine Appleton, Arno Grayling, and Rabin and Dave Mila. And they show very clearly here on the left of the slide, you see the postprandial glucose response coming from low energy sweeteners, either with or another, without any other nutrient. And in the lower left, you see the postprandial insulin response and to a low energy sweetener on your tongue. And what you do see is that, and this is the change in difference between no sweetness and sweetness, and what you see that it circles around 0. And so the ingestion of low energy sweeteners administered alone or with a nutrient containing preload has no acute effects on the postprandial glycemic or insulinemic response compared to a control intervention. So the reasoning that low energy sweeteners lead to a cephalic phase insulin response, although intuitively it's very appealing, and I must say 15 years ago I believed that that was true, but after spending years and years of money in research and not finding it, I think at some stage you have to take your loss and also to come and to change your opinion, because the data just showed that this is not true. So summarizing, I think there's no evidence that sweetness exposure leads to a higher sweetness preferences, not through repeated exposure and also not through cephalic phase insulin response. What I must acknowledge is that there are actually no long-term data available on sweetness exposure and sweetness preferences in I would say, long-term clinical trial, in a well-controlled clinical trial. And therefore, I think about 7 years ago, we started to find funding or possible funding for a large randomized clinical trial that would investigate the effects of, I would say, a very long-term exposure to either low dietary sweetness exposure or a high dietary sweetness exposure on the actual sweetness preferences in a free living environment and also in terms of metabolic responses. Finally, in 2019, we succeeded in getting the funding, and we run the trial from October 2020 to until June 2024. So we just finished the data collection of this sweet tooth study. And here you see the design of this study. And earlier this month, we collected the data from the last subject after 10 months of 4 months of follow-up. So we had a group of people with a very high sweet diet, people with a regular sweet diet, and people with a low sweet diet. And then after 6 months, we look at changes in sweetness preferences, but also changes in body weight and changes in glucose and insulin metabolism. We finished data collection. We haven't seen the results yet, and I hope to present the results in the coming years, for example, at the International Congress of Nutrition in Paris or at other symposia. But I will be very curious to see the outcome. To summarize the the data I showed is, I think there's no evidence that sweetness exposure leads to a higher sweetness preference. There's no effect of sweetness exposure on cephalic phase insulin response. And I think with respect to appetite and food intake, low energy sweeteners, drinks, they are very comparable to water. I didn't show the data here because of time issues, but I think there's plenty of evidence as well. And in addition, I didn't show the data here either but there are a lot of data in that respect. There's no relationship between sweetness liking and intake, or sweetness intake and obesity. So obese people, they don't express a higher liking for sweetness compared to non-normal weight people. And also if you have a higher intake of sweetness, so I'm not referring to sugar or low energy sweeteners, there's no relationship with weight. What of course is true is that there's a strong relationship between sugar sweetened beverages and obesity. And that's of course sweetness exposure, but it's only sugar sweetened beverages. They lead to a very brief exposure of sweetness compared to, I would say, solid sweetness. So I think there's a very big difference between sweetness exposure in the form of liquids, which is very transient and very short, compared to sweetness exposure of solids, for example, in fruits, which is very long and which has a dramatic other effect. And I think that's the effect of taste. And in order to illustrate this effect, and I think it's a nice illustration of what happens if you taste sweetness and then you look at the effect of appetite and liking. I hope the movie works. It's 1 minute and I think it's fun to look. So let's see whether it works. This is 1 kilogram of grapes, 2 kilograms of grapes, either consumed in the form of grape juice or in the form of grapes. And of course, the nutrient composition and the sugar content, everything is the same except for the texture. Just look at the effect on appetite and liking. Thank you for your attention.
De GRAAF.
Thank you, Dr. de GRAAF. I think that Maria Jose, who is the expert, can guide us through this part of the conversation. But if you allow me, Dr. DURÁN has been very efficient responding the questions in the Q&A chat, and maybe he can summarize the most important points in those questions. I think that would be useful to save time because we're already running out of it. Yes, that's an excellent idea. Dr. DURÁN, I think he already unmuted his mic. Maybe he can also share his video. Well, I'm afraid I cannot activate my video for some reason. I am inviting you to activate it. So, okay, there was an issue there that's sorted out. Okay, so what I will do, if you're okay with it, we're going to be reading through the questions, Dr. DURÁN. We will be asking you for the summary of your replies. I will give 30 seconds to Miguel so he can give us information that he needs to provide us with. And in the meantime, we can have a look. I know that Dr. LAVIADA has already selected some questions, and Dr. DURÁN will give us a long speech because he has answered several questions already, but I will give some 30 seconds to Miguel before we resume the conversation. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, and congratulations to all our speakers. This was a very interesting webinar, and it's clear by the size of our audience here today who have remained until the very end of these presentations. This event, as you know, has been organized by the ISA, and also ISA will be participating in our conference, FINUT 2024. For those who do not know much about the FINUT, this is the event where we decided to meet up with our community. Every 2 years, we choose every time a different Latin American country. And in this case, we are very happy to be able to organize this with the University of Antioquia in Medellin. So we are welcoming you all from the 24th to 26th of October. There are about 25 countries participating, and the scientific agenda, if you have the opportunity of checking it in our website, www.finut2024.com, there you will see not only the level, the degree of scientific excellence, but also the interesting talks that we will be hosting in this conference. It's also in this Congress, it is also a great opportunity for networking with healthcare providers. It's a very specific way of creating a networking environment. Many projects came about from the last Congress that we held. This is a really good opportunity. We have organized this in a moderate-sized manner so that you can really have the opportunity of meeting up with colleagues with whom you can share opportunities, concerns, and successes. So I invite you all. You can enjoy a reduced price for registering for our Congress until the 30th of June. And I would like to finish by thanking again all our speakers today. Thank you, Miguel. Well, let's resume this conversation space. I would like to share with you all that we will be forwarding the videos of this webinar, and they will also be available in the YouTube channel from the ISA. Dr. DURÁN, I will give you the floor in a minute, but I have a specific concern. I know that Chile has seen a reduction in the sugar consumption and sugar intake. There have been very positive results after the use of these shapes that you're using in the labeling. Is this the goal that you were expecting to achieve? Has there been a real reduction in the levels of overweight levels or obesity in any age populations? That would be my question, but also I'm looking forward to hearing the answers that you want to give to the rest of the questions that you have read. With regards to your last question, the last survey related to food was carried out in 2010, so we need to have a new survey at a national level. The latest data we have from 2016-2017, which was the starting point of the front labeling. And after we carry out a new survey, maybe we can give an answer to your question. However, there is a study that has been published related to children. If we have seen any changes after the front labeling, there have been no changes according to this publication in the weight of the children. We wanted to see a nutritional change condition when we launched this program, and we see that in the weight there are many factors involved, and some foods might be having a greater influence in this factor. So this is why other countries are not referring so much to the people's weight, because we are not expecting to see great changes looking forward. I think this is an answer to your question, but what we see is, why has the level of sugar decreased so much? People have not moved from drinking sugary drinks to drinking water. They've moved from sugary drinks to LNCS, sweetened beverages. In the supermarkets, you see that many supermarkets have reduced the amount of sugars, and they're using drinks sweetened with LNCS, but not without sugars exactly. People are drinking drinks with lower levels of sugar than they used to drink before. Among the questions that I have read, it might look that I am against the front labeling, but I think that it is very important to monitor the sweeteners intake in children, specifically in young children. Children below 3 years of age should not have LNCS. However, I think this is an idea that has come about in a sort of rushed manner, because if we used a warning seal, we could see a secondary effect that could be families increasing the intake of products having sugar. So this would take us some steps back in all the advances that we have made. If people think that it is safer to use sugar than using LNCS, this is something that could not be positive. Maybe for the food industry, it would be easier to go back to using sugars instead of reformulating the products when you see this warning seal in many products having LNCS. So this could take us back to 2016, and this could lead to an increase in the intake of sugars. So we do not really have data. Mexico does not have data available. So I would have waited to see what was happening in Mexico to see if it was a brilliant idea or a really bad idea to use this type of seals. So maybe we're going to be waiting 1 or 2 years more. I hope that I am wrong. I really do not have this glass ball to read the future. I'm not a wizard. I cannot really tell if this is a good or a bad idea. Many people believe that sweeteners, whether they're natural or artificial, they need to be submitted to certain authorizations and regulations, and they need to demonstrate that they have no effect. In the case of the monk fruit, the EFSA has not authorized it. The Codex has not given it the go-ahead. Some countries in Latin America have allowed the use of monk fruit. In the case of Chile, we do not have monk fruit allowed. I have never tried it, so if somebody could give me a small amount of monk fruit as a gift, I would be very happy. And I think that those were the main points. Thank you very much, Dr. Durán. I will move on to another question that personally, I believe all the speakers, by their experience, know that this was a must in terms of the questions that we needed to hear, which is about the fact that we have not talked about the effects of LNCS in the intestinal microbiota. So I think that this is specifically for Dr. de Graaf, but I would welcome any information that you want to elaborate on regarding to this. Well, what I could say is that everything that we could eat could affect the microbiota. Many effects in the microbiota from the foods that we have on a daily basis, the presence or absence of fiber, the presence of or absence of sugar, the macronutrients in the foods that we ingest will always affect the bacteria, the presence that we have that is very dynamic. Also, with regards to the non-caloric sweeteners, with regards to macrobiota, there have been several studies. The most or the better, the ones that are well known are have been made by an Israeli group that presents certain connections in the changes of the macrobiota and the changes in the levels of glucose or insulin. This team has done very elegant studies, but other studies do not prove that there have been many important changes in the macrobiota using the same sweeteners. This can depend greatly in the techniques used to assess the bacteria presence, and we are aiming to find uniformity in this type of studies to determine if the methods used are affecting the observational studies. If there is a connection between the intake of LNCS and the presence of obesity or chronic diseases, how can we explain this? Can we find a biological plausibility? But among these potential reasons, that is the one that was presented by Dr. de GRAAF, which is the liking of sweets, sweet flavors. And most of the studies that assess the changes in the macrobiota do not reflect any significant changes. We should have more consistency, more uniformity in the ways we assess the changes in the bacterian presence to reach more serious conclusions. Sometimes certain studies that show certain minor changes in the macrobiota have been given too much attention. And in many of these studies, we see that there's no comparison between the deep effect that the high amount of sugar intake might have compared to the small minor effect that the use of LNCS might have in the microbiota. We should have as a comparator not only the placebo, but also the deep dysbiosis created by the use of sugars compared to the use of LNCS. These studies need to be carried out so that we can have a really clear idea of what's going on when we replace sugars, if there are beneficial or negative effects in the microbiota.
I agree with that.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think as Dr. LAVIADA said, of course, everything that you eat has an impact on microbiota. So yeah, that's a pretty meaningless statement if you say that something has an effect on gut microbiota. You can also, with LCNS, they also say it has an effect on the brain. Of course, it has an effect on the brain. If I eat bread or if I drink water, it has an effect on the brain. Of course, you need to show that it's meaningful, and that requires much more evidence and careful studies, as Dr. LAVIADA has explained. So, yeah.
It's true that the microbiota topic is very interesting, but I think we're missing many studies, and I would say that we expect to see more studies related to the conventional foods compared to the use of LNCS products. I think with regards to the LAVIADA talk, I think it's been very interesting to see the studies done with human subjects, but I would also like to raise the topic that oftentimes we make decisions or we convey information based in studies on animals. And maybe there is a piece of news where it's been observed that a certain substance has this very damaging effect. And I would like to hear your opinions also, by what I have read and heard recently, one of the things that has been questioned is the sucralose due to its negative metabolic effects that have been observed in animals. I would like to know your take, Dr. LaViada, on this, if you have heard about these studies.
Yes, it's a bit risky because research on animals is of high interest to carry out trials before they're done on human beings. But there are things that are extrapolated. I'm going to give a very maybe simple example. But there are some studies that demonstrate that if we incorporate aspartame in animals, then they can have seizures. But aspartame never reaches the brain of a person or even of an animal if they take aspartame orally. What we're going to have is aspartamic acid that it comes from the hydrolysis from the intestinal tube. So I'm providing a very simple example, but it's useful to give us an idea on how cautious we need to be, particularly when it comes to microbiota, because rodents' microbiota is different from human microbiota, and the doses used in animals are much higher than the ones compared to ADI. Sometimes these tests are done carefully, but of course the effects on humans are completely different. Another example is the cephalic phase that Professor de GRAAF was mentioning. For example, when the sweetener reaches the savory glands and is different in animals and in humans. So we have to be careful with these extrapolations, and we have to make sure to have compared results in different species. Excellent, doctor. Thank you very much. I have some questions for Dr. de GRAAF over here. First of all, doctor, if preference studies for likeness of sweet have always been done on adults, are there studies on children? And then there's an attendee that wonders whether there's knowledge of sugar liberates dopamine in the brain, and that's why we prefer it, and whether sweeteners can have the same effect. There's a lot of interest in this kind of studies, and that's why we have all of these questions coming.
There have been studies in children on also sweetness preferences. I've done myself quite some studies in children. What you see is that preference for sweetness in babies is very, very high, and it slowly declines until adulthood. So 4-year-olds have higher preference for sweetness compared to 10-year-olds, and 15-year-olds have lower, and adults have a lower sweetness preference compared to children. And I think that's a natural that happens in Dutch children, in US children, in American children, and will happen, I think, everywhere in the world where babies, they love sweetness, and that slowly declines until adulthood. We've done also studies on repeated exposure to sweetness in 8 to 11-year-old children, whether we exposed them to a sweet lemonade or a sour lemonade, and looked at whether they changed their preference for sweetness or sourness. We did it in children and adults, and we saw no changes in preferences for. So I think the repeated exposure effect is not so important in guiding the optimal level of sweetness. And I do think that, yes, sweetness response releases probably dopamine or reward response in the brain. You get happy because of sweetness, or I enjoy it, and most people in the world enjoy a certain amount of sweetness. And well, it's part of pleasure in life, I think. So yeah, and we should enjoy it. I do think the sugar-sweetened beverages where you consume, I think with sweetness in sugar-sweetened beverages, you're only so briefly exposed to the taste that most of the sugar goes into your body without being perceived. So in that sense, it's a kind of waste of calories because you ingest it, but you don't taste it. And that's not good because you do get fat from it. Yeah, so that's... Is this an answer to the question? Yeah.
Yes, and I believe Maria Jose has really chosen the questions well with regard to infant population and with regard to their nervous system. Out of curiosity, I was wondering, why did you present this randomized trial test that has just been finished? Because I believe that it's going to provide us with numerous answers, and we're really looking forward for it to be published. But in the meantime, I was wondering, in those 3 types of interventions, which was what was being consumed? Could you give us a little bit more detail with regard to these interventions?
Yes, it was quite difficult because we had to have a diet with very high sweetness and diet with very low sweetness and maintain, say, the macronutrient levels of foods. So it was also, I didn't do it myself, but there were an army of dietitians who provided foods to the people. I think the main foods that we used were spreads for on bread. In the Netherlands, we consume a lot of bread. I think that's probably different compared to Latin America, where you consume, but many people and things like yogurts that can be sweet, and of course spreads can also be savory. Snacks can be either sweet, so you can have chocolate, but you can also have savory snacks like a hamburger or meat-like snacks. So those were the differences in the types of foods. And first we had, it's funny because first we had issues with the ethical committee because they thought, well, a diet high in sweetness will lead to people being overweight. And then we discussed the data and finally they agreed. And I don't know the outcome yet. What I do know is that there were no people excluded because of high weight gain, because that was when people would gain weight, a lot of weight during the trial, the ethical committee would say that we have to get out, that people have to be dismissed. So I'm very excited. I don't know the data. It's also double blind. So curious. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We're all looking forward to finding out those results, and we'll keep posted. I think that Dr. LAVIADA wants to say something about it. I would like to answer some of the questions on why LNCS is not recommended in younger children. This depends on the regulation in different countries, but I'd like to clarify that these recommendations are not based on toxicity or adverse effects, but most of the pediatric associations recommend not to use them because there don't seem to be good reasons to restrict calories in younger children, where growth is important and it's a stage in life. Just like during pregnancy, we don't recommend strategies of drastic reduction in weight. That's the reason, not because of matters of toxicity. And I didn't present you because I didn't have time, but I have a slide on RCT in children, a meta-analysis and a new study that we're carrying out together with Dr. Espinosa at Harvard University, where we've assessed RCTs and even observational studies. And we didn't see in children a weight increase with the use in LNCS during childhood and adolescence. From my point of view, and in order to complement what said Dr. Durán, I believe that in Mexico, the decision not to recommend LNCS was a bit rushed, and it was made based on sweetness likeness theories and aspects that are more related to the suspicion or to the idea that children might develop a likeness to sweetness, or it might favor obesity among children. But evidence does not seem to show that children gain weight with this kind of sweeteners. And this is what we're going to publish this year. By the end of the year, the results of our meta-analysis on RCT and observational studies in children. And in order to answer a concrete question on whether we have studies, health studies for life using this substitution strategy, I believe that the group of John Simon Piper that I recommend has assessed these outcomes, and particularly very powerful ones like regard cardiovascular disease, diabetes, using the change and meta change and substitution methods, and they haven't found an increase in these outcomes. And there are even some discrete reductions when cohort studies are analyzed following this methodology that I believe is going to be the future for these kinds of assessments. Excellent, Doctor. We have two very ambiguous questions. We have 3 minutes to come to an end, but I believe that it's actually interesting because our attendees are asking, why doesn't the industry promote the development of more studies or more unified methodologies to carry out this study so that we can have more profound conclusions on this LNCS that is being used? But then we have a question about whether these results are influenced by the industry. And I would like to ask you this question. Maybe some of you wants to call me if they've had this research experience, because we do know that it's the industry responsibility to carry out the studies, but sometimes when these studies are carried out, sometimes they carry certain bias on the result, particularly because of us professionals.
Well, no.
Please, Dr. GRAAF, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think studies sponsored by industries, they will be considered, and as they say, oh yeah, the academics are and the puppets in the strings of the industry. Of course, that's an agenda. I know with like the Sweet 2 study that we did, it's partially funded by the government, partially by food industries across the world. What we did do is we installed a steering committee of independent scientists who have no relation with industry, and they govern the conclusions of the trial. So the industry partners, they have no say in the design of the study, they have no say in the results of the study, and they have no say in the, and they have no say in the interpretation of the data. So that's governed by an independent body of scientists. Whether you can prevent the narrative, no. They will always say, well, it's a Koch-funded study. It's the industry having its arms in academics. Yeah, what can you do? I don't know. I don't know. I don't think you can do the governance of the trial. You can do it in an independent way. You can do it transparent. We published the methodology. We will publish the statistical analysis beforehand on clinicaltrials.gov. We will be open in any aspects, but still people will say it's biased. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. de Graaf. Dr. LaViada, did you want to add something to this? Yes, I briefly wanted to say that there are tools to assess the quality of studies, like, for example, the GRADE tool from the Cochrane Organization for Observational Studies, the Newcastle model, that allow us to assess what's important. That means whether the randomization was done properly, the selection of data, and we have to prevent that narrative on financing, and we need to review each study based on their scientific merits. No, if the quality, thanks to these tools, well, points out to the fact that the study has high quality criteria or moderate or low or very low criteria. That's what we need to take into account, and not that much what's the origin of such studies. There are studies that are financed by non-governmental or governmental international organizations that might have low quality, and there are some industry financed or funded studies that have very high quality, and vice versa. So we need to pay attention to the scientific merits of the work, and we have tools to do so. Excellent, Dr. Esther. Well, I've already taken way too long, and I'm being sent messages that we need to come to an end, even though this is a very interesting topic. We always have pending questions to be answered. We could be talking about this every month and still have relevant data. Dr. Moreno, I'm going to leave you the floor to wrap up. And doctors, thank you very much for your participation today. And this is the purpose of FINUT and ISA, to have verified evidence, science to our people, so that people can develop this critical thinking in order to make their own decisions based on that scientific knowledge. We're all professionals, and I believe that our purpose is to carry this knowledge and to convey this scientific results. So thank you very much for your participation nowadays. And Dr. Moreno, if you want to wrap up, thank you very much, Maria Jose. Well, I would only like to thank, first of all, the ISA for enabling the organization of this webinar. The communication has been excellent, and communication with them, and I believe that this has resulted on the wonderful choice of speakers we had today. We've had excellent presentation. They've been really high quality presentations, so I'd like to congratulate the four of you, even though we couldn't see the first one, but I'm sure we'll have the opportunity to see it. And I would like to thank them for devoting this time, not only to share their presentations, but to answer the questions by our audience, and in such a wonderful way. And to wrap up, I'd like to invite you all to participate in our FINUT community, and particularly if you have the opportunity, in our conference that will take place in October in Medellin. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, our attendees, for being so numerous and so active. Thank you, ISA. You have some information in that PowerPoint that I'm sharing with all of you. If you need your certificate, you need to write to our email that you'll see on the screen. You have to point out your full name and your email so that we can prove your attendance today, thanks to Zoom reports. Thank you very much, everybody. And have a very nice morning, afternoon, or evening, because we're present in all time frames. Thank you very much.